Next, I'm going to talk about a really obscure one that very few people will remember, but it was kind of a special event. And it was Steve Burns. And this is an actor who did a kids show called Blue's Clues. You may remember this if you have kids who are now 20 or so. There was this show called Blue's Clues, and at some point Steve Burns decided he was going to be a rock folk musician instead of a kids actor. And so he did this really interesting in-store, and it was at the Underground store on Alameda, and a bunch of little kids came and their parents, and he was really sweet, and we had this poster and he signed it in crayon, and it was just such a different in-store, and one that not a lot of people came to or knew about, but it was very special for the kids who were there and for the people who did know about who he was. And the poster I really like because it's got kids' drawings on it and he signed it in crayon and stuff. So that was Steve Burns, the guy from Blue's Clues. Next, John Cale, someone who I was very, very in awe of, member of the Velvet Underground, somebody I really wanted to be here. However, we had a couple of things happen at that in-store that were interesting. One was, in those days, I used to record every in-store. I wanted them for myself. I just thought it was a really cool thing to have a tape recording of all our in-stores. So I would set up my DAT player on the soundboard. When John Cale got here with his guy, they walked right up to the soundboard, grabbed my DAT player, pulled it out, and said, "Nobody's recording this." And I said, okay. John Cale was not someone to be trifled with. He did an in-store. It was amazing. He did, I think this was when he had his album Black Paper out, and he really was very intense. Then when he signed, he was tough. People brought up anything that he didn't think was appropriate. He would not sign it. Big guy with this heavy kind of Welsh accent, and I remember some guy came up with a couple of Velvet Underground bootlegs, and he was like, "These are bootlegs," and he throws them back at the guy and wouldn't sign them, and it was interesting. And I love the poster Chris did. I thought it was really great. I was very proud to have John Cale, but there was a couple of, he stood for no shit, and those were two examples of the shit he did not stand for. And that was in October of '05. Next, Trey Anastasio, 10/22/06. We moved into this store that day, I think, or that within 2 days of that, maybe even the next day we opened. I had known a guy named Patrick Jordan for years and years, and he worked for RCA, and he ended up working for Music Today, Corn Capshaw, who was the manager of Fish and Trey Anastasio. I am a huge Fish fan. I wanted to open this store with a bang. So I emailed Patrick and said, "Listen, I realize this is a crazy request, but how about if Trey played the opening of my store?" I think he was playing in town at the Fillmore, and we could work this out somehow. And amazingly enough, Patrick said, "I can make this happen." I remember the email he sent back to me. He said, "Maybe let me ask Big Red," which I thought was really funny that he calls Trey Big Red because he has red hair. Anyway, it happened, and we weren't ready to open the store yet, but I said, "We got to make this happen." He said yes. So I think actually the store wasn't even open yet. It was the night before we were going to open, but we did it, and we probably had 500 people. Incredible in-store, probably one of the best ever in terms of emotion and excitement and the amount of people. Plus I was moving into my new store, and one of my favorite artists agreed to do this set. He did, wild stuff that he rarely plays. As a side note, that's something interesting, Trey was amazing. He could not have been nicer. He signed autographs for probably 4 hours, hugged everybody, got into deep conversations with everybody, seemed great. probably a month or two later is when he got arrested in New York, and the fate of Fish broke up shortly thereafter for a couple of years, and he went to jail, and his entire life changed. So this was really kind of one of the last events of the old Trey before he came back as the revitalized and cleaned up Trey. But you would have never known it here, because he couldn't have been better. And I'm still so grateful to Patrick Jordan and Trey Anastasio for doing that. Really great. 10/22/06. Next, let's talk about the Czars from 10/29/04. This was at the Alameda store. The Czars were a Denver band, and their lead singer, John Grant, worked for us. John Grant is now a huge star. This guy plays, stadium-sized venues in Europe, especially in Europe. Mojo magazine had it. The last two albums were their #1 albums of the year. He's become a huge star, and he was our little John Grant. We loved him so much, and he was such a great part of our store. And I remember he was like, I really want to do a Czars in store, and I don't think anybody will come, but I really want to do it here because I love the store. So we did it, and hardly anybody came, but it was the Czars, and it was John, and his voice is so amazing, and it's been such a wonderful experience for me and Patrick and Natasha and the various people who worked with him here, who are still here and have watched him become this gigantic star. And we think, gee, that was the guy who played a very ill-attended in-store at Twist and Shout. So that was the Czars in 04. A couple more. This is going on, so I don't want to go too long. Phil Lesh, 8/14/99. After Jerry died in 95, the Grateful Dead kind of went into hibernation for a while. Phil Lesh, it turned out, had hepatitis, had to get a liver transplant, kind of disappeared, and everybody thought it was over for him. Unbelievably, he came back with this series of shows called Phil Lesh and Friends. And I remember they did a camp, kind of like a camp tour, where he got all the different jam bands, String Cheese Incident, Mo, this, that, the other, Leftovers, all the different guys, and he picked members from them, and they would open for him, and then the members would play with him. And that was the first Phil Lesh and Friends tour. And that lasted for about a year with this rotating group of people. So I had the bright idea, gee, maybe we could get him to do a signing at the store. And if we made a poster and you bought the poster, he had no new music, but I said maybe we could get a poster and we could get people to buy the poster, and all the money could go to Bonfils Blood, because of the liver transplant. Phil Lesh was really into blood drives. So this was essentially, I had two employees make posters. Tom Knapp was one, and Jeff, I forget his last name, was the other, but they both made these beautiful posters, and the Tom Knapp one I think is the one we have that you're looking at now. And we sold these posters, and hundreds of people came, and it was a really big deal for me, because a huge Deadhead and Phil Lesh seemed like he was done. But then he came back, and he was there with his wife and his two young sons, who are now adults and have their own bands. And just hundreds of Deadheads showed up. It was such an emotional day. Probably 500 or 600 people lined up outside the store, and he signed for everybody and was such a sweetheart. And we sold the posters and made a big contribution to Bonfils Blood. And it was a very, very, very special event. So I think that's probably enough for this time. But there's more posters that you'll see. We're going to show you more than I'm going to talk about, and then we'll continue down that wall, and I'll do more. I'll eventually get through that whole wall, and we'll talk about the in-store wall for Tales of the Wall. So this has been Paul Epstein, and this has been Tales of the Wall, Volume 14, and I'll see you next time. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year to everybody. Oh yeah, and Kwanzaa, and Ramadan, and everything we're with you.